We're going to start in 30 seconds. I want to give folks another second, or a couple more seconds to join the live stream before we jump into questions. So sit tight.
All right. And then do we have a share screen game?
You can share your screen. Yes, I am not planning to share my screen. Although if you had something you wanted to pull up, Michael, you certainly could.
All right. No, we'll take it from there. So we'll just get right into the questions.
Okay. All right. So why don't we go ahead and get started? And if you tune in and later and you missed the intro, this will be up on YouTube, so you can watch the full video at your leisure. So welcome to another Forta workshop. These workshops are where we highlight how the largest projects in Web3 use Forta to monitor the security and health of their systems. Today, I'm joined by Michael Llewellyn from OpenZeppelin and the Protocol Security Advisor for Compound. Michael, welcome.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me, Andy.
Yeah, Michael's one of my favorite people to talk to about smart contract security. I learn an enormous amount every time we do. And Michael and I are going to talk about how Compound is using Forta. So Michael, first question, for those not familiar, back in December, OpenZeppelin was approved by the Compound DAO as the full-time, as the continuous security auditor and security advisor. The scope of that relationship includes a number of things, but specifically real-time monitoring. And so I think it's important for listeners to understand how a protocol and community like that approach monitoring and dashboarding and incident response. There's a whole sort of back office, right, aspect to this that a user and a community member may not see. Can you talk a little bit about what OpenZeppelin is doing in that regard and why it's important for any protocol to do this?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, Compound is definitely one of our first kind of DAO partnerships where we're going a little bit further than what we normally do with a client. Like OpenZeppelin has historically been very focused on audits, but really only audits in terms of the services we provide. We obviously have products like OpenZeppelin Defender that we've recently come out with. Everyone's using open source contracts, but in the services side, we'd kind of been focused on just doing auditing, but there was a pain point a lot of our clients, and especially Compound, were feeling with just auditing in general, which is that usually you're trying to book auditors pretty far out. There's long backlogs. Sometimes the timing doesn't quite line up. And in the case of Compound, they had these protocol changes going out, even small ones, that did have a big impact on the protocol. And they had one particular change that caused a lot of issues. And so there was an impetus within the community to find an audit firm and retain them essentially full time to avoid this kind of like headache of booking an auditor and then missing a deadline or things like that. So that was the initial need. But when we got brought in essentially to, hey, we're having an open forum discussion on we want an audit partner, we went a little bit further and we said, we think that auditing is important, but if we're going to do a full DAO partnership, we think that monitoring is also going to be a crucial part of this. This is when Forta was in its early days. This is, we still have monitoring and Defender. So we were saying, we've got these tools. We think it's appropriate that Compound use them, and we want to make that part of the partnership. And in many ways, we had other top firms like Trail of Bits and Chain Security come in and also bid on that same project. And the pricing ended up being pretty similar, but I think what put us ahead was the fact we were willing to say, we're going to give you a little extra. We're going to actually work on monitoring solutions. And I think the Compound community said, this sounds cool. But I actually think there was an understanding of why or how it'd be important, and it was going to be on us to ultimately figure that out.
Awesome. So that is a great lead into my next question. And after this, we can jump into use cases. So I spend a majority of my day talking with protocol teams about real-time monitoring, and a message I hear time and time again is that particularly on like the invariant and threat anomaly side, teams just don't know what to monitor for. You see a lot of performance monitoring. You see a lot of really basic event and operational monitoring out there in the market. So I guess, so this is a question about sort of the scope of monitoring and how you identify what you care about and what to watch. So in the case of Compound, like what was that process like? How did you come up with the things that your I guess your monitoring priorities, for lack of a better term?
Great question. Yeah, because that is, I think, the core piece for how teams think about Forta. I think like there's a general policy of, I think, for any team that wants to understand it on their own, like just starting with threat modeling and thinking like, what are the things that keep me up at night, and start thinking about like, well, you would at least want to know if it's happening versus waking up tomorrow and then, it's all you find are ashes. Um, but for us in Compound, what we really did is just start with, first of all, understanding the system from top to bottom. So when we did that, we started a partnership. We started with a full audit of the existing protocol. We basically looked at it and started thinking about, like, first of all, making sure this is secure, because if someone's going to put a change on that protocol, understanding the underlying system means is crucial to understand the security impact. But then at the same time, we started thinking, okay, now that we know what the protocol is and we kind of know where maybe some of the like strong points and weak points are, what are things that we think would be valuable to monitor? And we started very early on simply posting this in regular updates to the community saying, we've conducted this audit, we have these ideas for alerts, and just kind of iteratively working through, getting some feedback from community members, doing other audit engagements and other things that we learned from. So like one thing we learned a lot from actually is we found one critical bug in Compound that had also been found by Chain Security previously. That was basically a double entry point, which, to simplify, is basically was more than one way to call a token, and it broke an assumption in Compound. And we're like, so basically, for any token that's listed on Compound, there's a massive reliance on ensuring that token fits a certain standard. It doesn't introduce any integration issues, and not only is that an issue for something you have to check when you're listing a token, but if that token's upgradable, then that could change in the future. You could have a token that gets upgraded by a separate team, separate from Compound, and that breaks assumptions that Compound has. So that was immediately something that jumped out to us as like, that's something we want to watch. That's something we want to monitor. And that's something we built a monitoring system for, to keep an eye on that. And then just broadly speaking, in terms of what do you listen to, what do you not listen to, we definitely wrote a lot of bots. Some bots are noisier than others. We wrote general bots on just watching the market activity, watching for liquidations, watching for governance events, watching for multisig events, things that like are probably going to be pretty recurring. And when we built a solution for Compound, we focused on Discord as a great place. The community already is pretty active, and there was already a bot there that was doing some of the basic stuff I just described, but we built on top, and we separated it out into different channels. We said, okay, a market feed channel, that's going to be noisy. Everyone knows it's noisy. Governance feed, a little less noisy, but you see alert there, you're not going to immediately think the sky is falling. You're like, it's probably someone voting. And then we created a security alert channel, and that specifically is the place where we feed in the alerts that we don't expect to happen every day. And if that alerts get fired, it doesn't mean necessarily that something's going wrong, but it means there's something weird, something suspicious, something worth looking at. And as of today, we've had this thing running for like several weeks now. Publicly, it's only fired one alert. And that one alert, while it wasn't something that was bad, it was suspicious. It was a really weird series of transactions using flash loans going between different markets. We briefly took a look at it and saw that it wasn't anything major, but it was something to note, something to say, hey, this is not common, and it doesn't happen every day. Maybe at least make sure it's not something we should be worried about.
Well, you answered my question, which was what was the alert. So thanks for jumping in on that. So I get, just to kind of recap, then it sounds like there's some institutional knowledge that auditors have, right? If you've seen a lot of contracts, a lot of scenarios, a lot of integrations, you can bring that perspective into a conversation. Sounds like you also crowdsourced this with the community, and you solicited feedback, so you have inputs from different parties. You did a full audit of the protocol, so you're sort of re-examining everything end to end, and then sounds like there's some sort of it can be helpful if you kind of divide it up into categories, right? You talked about like there's operational things that you expect to see, and then there's things that you hope you never see that are critical. So okay, well I think that's a good summary. Let's jump into some examples. So Mike, you brought up the exploit last fall
Mm-hmm.
that had to do with the controller upgrade. I know Compound has a bot running on Forta that monitors Compound distributions from the finance controller. It sounds like that is related to that same sort of contract that was in scope for the exploit. Is that, I guess, am I right on that? And sort of what's the benefit of monitoring comp reward distributions?
Gotcha. So that's actually an interesting one because that's an alert. That's one of the monitoring pieces that we're still working to optimize. We built it. It's running on Forta, but it's not running in Discord yet. The reason for that is it's actually the trickier one to figure out because ultimately what distributions on Compound are doing is they're just saying Compound rewards are being distributed to users. They could be people who are just using the marketplace and they're getting kind of an extra reward on top of their normal interest payments. Or interest rewards, I should say. Or they might be contributors to the Compound protocol. They might be people that are getting exclusive rewards kind of for work they're doing. And that includes Open Zeppelin. So when it comes down to how do you detect weird distributions, basically the smart contract should define who's getting a distribution, but the smart contract, if it's wrong, if something happens to the smart contract, how do you know automatically what's proper and what's right? And we actually were starting out with trying to use the distribution monitor in our initial solution. And we actually kind of took a step back because it was actually one of the noisier ones. And it wasn't always clear, okay, this account's getting a lot more money versus this account or most accounts, but is that like a normal thing or is that a weird thing? So that's actually a great example of something that's challenging to monitor programmatically. But we're doing iterations on that bot. We're trying to figure out what are ways to use heuristics that are time sensitive that can more accurately detect changes that still aren't going to be it might be able it can't verify is that okay or not, but it might be able to be a bit pickier about what's suspicious versus what's just normal. And that's like I think that's an issue that we've seen with a lot of other potential monitoring on Forta is just trying to pick out, okay, what's going to be the stuff that we really want to know about versus the stuff that happens all the time, or just what's going to be useful. So I think, it's something I see as solvable. But it's one of the trickier ones for us because we do want to, because it was a problem Compound ran into, we want to see if we can monitor for that in a way that would have potentially prevented that issue in the past, even though other things like auditing and others were also necessary there.
Okay. Yeah, that's an interesting one where it seems like if the goal is to identify unexpected behavior or odd behavior, then you need some baseline. You need some way to define like, well, what is expected, which would imply you need some historical. You need a large enough sample size to say, well, this is out of bounds of what we would expect based on the last 3 months of distributions.
Yep. That's a good way to summarize it. And so we're still thinking through the best way to do that, but I think it is achievable. It's just a question of once we get it out there, we want it to be alerts that people pay attention to, and it's not just like firing it off every other 5 minutes and people are like, oh, I'm just going to stop paying attention. Because at that point, then the security solution is, it can if it's a firing alerts all day and then it's finally, I guess it's crying wolf 50 times a day and then one time it cries wolf at the right time, no one's going to be around to pay attention. So that's the key part. That's where we're trying to strike that balance.
Okay. All right, when I was going through the list of bots, I found another interesting one that I think is timely. We've seen a couple incidents of malicious governance attacks that have been carried out in sort of a variety of ways, but generally speaking, some actor is able to acquire whatever position they need to acquire to push a vote through, and depending on how that governance system is structured, right, that may be easier or harder to do. You may be able to do it relatively quickly, and so I know Compound has what they call a large borrows governance monitor. Can you talk a little bit about what this is watching for, and why watching for this is particularly valuable nowadays?
Yes. This actually came out of a real world example that we saw back in February, where we actually did see a case where someone noticed in the community on their own, hey, someone borrowed a large amount of comp recently. What's that about? And then sure enough, a day or two later, someone makes a proposal. They borrowed that comp specifically to get over the limit for comp to have a proposal. You have to have, like, I think at that time it was like 75 or 50,000 comp to make a proposal. And so basically there was someone who basically had on their own raised the alarm on their own accord, and even then it wasn't entirely clear what to do about it. In that case, people talked about that particular incident as a governance attack, and it ended up being a proposal for True USD to like just adjust the collateral in the protocol. And the DAO, the proposal ended up getting rescinded because the community was a little ticked off that it was like happening last minute. And then they ended up just resubmitting it later, and it all worked out. But it was like kind of a clear case of, okay, what happens if someone ultimately does a big borrow and then tries to push through a proposal, and not just a proposal, but maybe they also, as in just getting the proposal in and putting it through the governance process that is going to take still several days. But what happens if someone also borrows enough comp to then pass that proposal, regardless of what the rest of the community says? So basically what our monitor does is it monitors for those two events. If someone borrows a large amount of comp, it looks to see, hey, is that enough comp to pass the proposal? If so, fire the alert. And is that enough comp to even potentially like pass quorum, as in to basically be able to pass it all on its own, even if no one shows up, or even potentially if some people vote against it. And that's also going to fire alert. And that's actually one that we fire in the governance channel specifically, because maybe there's a lot of people that borrow comp for perfectly good reasons. They're like, I just want to make a proposal, and I'm not trying to do anything suspicious here. But it would still be good for people to at least know, hey, someone might make a proposal soon because they borrowed a lot of comp.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting one, and I know that there are several other bots running on Forta that sort of generically monitor some of this activity, because I know we've started to see more of it. So interesting. Okay, the next use case I wanted to explore was, and this overlaps with, I think, one of the most common monitoring use cases that I see is monitoring multisigs. And there's a variety of reasons why you would want to monitor multisig. I know Compound has a bot monitoring the community multisig for important transactions, for admin related events. Can you talk about sort of why a multisig is a sort of interesting asset to watch?
Yeah, in the case of Compound, it's essentially there to be it's kind of there to be a faster response to incidents that governance can't respond to quickly enough. Because with Compound and many other DAOs, there's time lock changes where basically if you want to change something in Compound, whether it's a parameter or the code itself, and it could be in response to a bug, for example, it's going to take a minimum of 7 days. The multisig is there to be able to act quicker. It's a bunch of people from the Compound community, including Compound Labs, that basically can immediately pause the markets if they need to. They can also do other things. They can kind of whitelist proposals. They can do a few other things that, they can't touch user funds. They can't do a few things that only the DAO can do, but they have special privileges that could impact people. So, for example, let's say that I am, running a DeFi protocol that interacts with Compound. Like I use Compound markets for something. Origin is an example of that. I am depending on those markets to be active. And if suddenly that market is paused, then that immediately has an impact on my protocol. So knowing what the multisig's up to and getting an immediate alert saying, it's done a pause, even though it won't necessarily change the impact it has on you, you immediately know, it's been paused, as opposed to you not knowing what's going on. And then second of all, what's like the update? You can immediately follow up and say, okay, hey, it got paused. What's going on? So you have the context for what's going on. These admin decisions, and it could also be like more boring, not serious stuff that happens. But nevertheless, it's good to know what the multisig's up to. And in other cases, like not just Compound, but other multisigs have even more control. They have the ability to initiate upgrades. They have the ability to potentially do changes without even having a time lock, which makes things a little bit more complicated. But I would say, in general, multisigs, especially Genosis safes, are really important to watch. There's a lot of Twitter discussion a week or two ago about like Chainlink's multisig. They have a multisig that controls all of their Oracle feeds, which also includes Compound, which we also monitor because Chainlink has a massive impact on DeFi. If those Oracle pricing mechanisms are modified in a way that breaks certain assumptions, which we saw, for example, with Luna. When it got depegged, Chainlink price feeds turned off, and a few protocols didn't control for that. They didn't know what to do with a stale price. That had a big impact. So being able to watch that multisig, watch all the multisigs where you're potentially integrated with the protocol that you're depending on, is, I think, going to be important, because you got to be able to just know what's coming down the pipeline. And I think it's really especially important for the protocols that you're working with, if they're truly crucial, to hopefully have a time lock or some sort of delay to say, even if the multisig can do something like upgrade to a new version that potentially breaks something, maybe having a 2-day head start on like looking at that and understanding it and then responding is better than just getting a heads up of if this has already happened, and if it broke something, then you're basically in disaster recovery mode, not preventative mode.
So it sounds like the one benefit of this is that you're socializing broadly things that could have a larger impact radius. It could have a larger impact radius. Mike, do you also worry about, because multisigs are sort of naturally centralized to some extent, like, do you worry about fraud at all? Are there instances of that? It would obviously require collusion, right? But if you only need so many signers to do something, and they do something bad, then monitoring their actions seems sort of reasonable.
I mean, I'll do you one better, which is like for some multisigs, there's no. How do you know that's 5 people? Like, especially when we have anonymous ones. How do you know that's 5 people or just one person with 5 keys? Right. There's a lot of scenarios that we have to worry about. So yeah, I mean, I'm worried about multisigs where there's not a lot of transparency around how they operate. That's just a general concern, because they could be doing everything right, but you're trusting that, and that's kind of the sort of trust factor that doesn't make sense in a crypto world. I understand if a corporation does that, they have a security by obscurity practice. They've been doing it forever. Maybe it's not the best thing in the world, but they get it, or I get it. I get what they're doing. But like in this world where we're kind of focusing on security through transparency, I think it's definitely disappointing for some multisigs to not be clear about what they're up to. And yeah, I think having monitoring on that, whether they're setting up the monitoring in the case of Compound, or other people are just deciding to monitor it, to say, like, whether Shane's going to tell me anything about what their multisig's up to, I'm going to watch that thing like a hawk and fire alerts, and hopefully get a heads up on what might be going on. But even then, I think for protocols that are going to trust other protocols, having requirements or recommendations to say, hey, we'd like to integrate you into our protocol, but we would really like you to be like checking these boxes of, you have a clear multisig, you've done a key signing ceremony to show that they're individual keys with individual people. We know who the people are. They have reputation, they have respect, they're trusted. And there's an understanding of what this multisig is here to do. I mean, for example, with the Compound multisig, it's clearly there not to handle user funds, not to stop withdrawals, not to have these permissions. And you can check the code to even check it or to confirm that, including an audit. It's there to do pausing. It's there to do some administrative stuff. It's not there to have access to user funds. So having, just as a baseline, that clear expectation, but then maybe even in the future going further and saying the multisig is also here to respond to incidents, and they're going to take this long, and they're going to have, different procedures and different ways of automating these particular things that are going to be important, that we're still, as an advisor to Compound, trying to help think through and recommend things they can do there, including how they like look at an alert that comes in from Forta and deciding what to do about it. There's a lot of things that I think are still left on the table in terms of defining, like, essentially incident response process with multisigs. You don't know, for example, you don't want to be in the case where, like, 2 out of 3 of the people that you need for that multisig are awake, and in the meantime you're just waiting for someone to knock on their door, turn their notifications back on before you can save your billion-dollar protocol. Like, that's not good. So, but we still want decentralization in a multisig so that there isn't like one person with the keys to the kingdom. So how do you balance that? And there are ways we're thinking through as well. But I think that's the cusp of where we're at. But I do think Forta is going to be an important part of providing those decision makers just first knowing what's going on and then deciding what to do about it.
Mike, you talked a lot about transparency And one thing that I always talk to teams about when I'm pitching them Forta is that we're one sort of a way Forta differentiates itself from other monitoring solutions is that alerts are by default public on Forta, and it's actually it's a compelling selling point for, I think, protocols that have made it through that decentralization roadmap. So we're talking about teams like Maker and Compound, and a few others that are more mature. I know that you talked about sort of integrating these Forta alerts into public Discord channels. Like, why was that so important to do? What's the value of making all this stuff public to a community?
I think it's just to understand, first of all, just to have that information. You don't necessarily need to check it, but just knowing it's there in public puts a different incentive structure around everything that goes on. But it also changes. I think it changes the sense of ownership, because right now, like, the sense of ownership is like whoever has access to the information is probably it's incumbent that they should do something about it when they're given it. So if only the protocol team has access to a security alerts, then it's really only they're the only ones that can do anything about a security incident. They're the only ones that have the information to act. When you put it in the hands of a larger community and you say this is available for everyone, it's both good for them because now they have transparency, they understand what's going on. But I would say it's also a responsibility on them, or at least a small part of a larger community's responsibility to figure out what to do when you see an alert and you're like, oh, that's suspicious. Someone should probably take a look at that and figure it out. And anyone's free to do that. And maybe, it's an awkward hour where the protocol team wouldn't be up, but there's some guy in Shanghai that loves Compound and watches the community Discord and sees that. And they're the first ones to figure out what's going on. Like, you never know. There's a lot. You're crowdsourcing essentially your threat intelligence. There's pros and cons to that. I mean, the con is, like, yes, people that you might not want knowing that there's an attack. You might immediately say, oh, there's going to be a press release or something, and people are talking. Well, people are immediately going to be talking. So the good thing is people are going to immediately be talking. The bad thing, people is immediately going to be talking. But there's, frankly, in the blockchain world, like, we already see hacks. As soon as a hack happens and significant money is being moved, everyone's talking about it. So we might as well make that a standardized process where the people that should definitely know, the people that are in the community, the people that are the protocol team, and then they can then figure out what to do from there. I think the next step after you have monitoring is then defining what you do with it. But I think that transparency is key, because it just changes the mentality. It's no longer about how do we spin this, how do we, pretend that it wasn't a big deal. Like, the information's out there. People are going to figure out and decide what they're going to think. The question is going to be ultimately then, what do you do about
it? That point really resonates with me, and I'm glad you also brought up sort of the dynamic of that exists around sensitive security related alerts, for example. And you shared your take here, but I kind of want to revisit this for a minute. Like, this is a common question we get when we talk about Forta alerts being public by default. And I know there are certain teams out there, certain security professionals, maybe who just have this ideology, or who came from, traditional sort of Web2 security background, right? That are used to things being very, playing the best, I would say very, very close to the chest. And you don't want to share particularly unverified, sensitive information. So this leads me to my follow-up question, which is, is there a balance you need to strike between sort of an alert that could be a false positive that sort of spooks a community or a market, versus something that is a legitimate alert that you do really want to notify everyone about?
Yes, that's a good question, because it comes down to, like, the way our system works, where it's currently going to fire alerts, some of which are simply not going to be attacks, but they're just suspicious. And so it's like, what's green, what's yellow, what's red. Red being the thing that, like, probably everyone immediately starts to react to. Yellow's in the middle. Green is like, just go on with your business. I think the way you convey that information is crucially important, and it does put a lot of the onus on, essentially us, the people building the solution, but anyone else building on Forta, to think of, like, the end user. and to think not from the perspective of, well, I expect them to, investigate it and learn it and not immediately work on first impressions. Like we know it's going to be probably first impressions. And actually what we did with Discord, and this was something that was already going with an existing bot they had by a community member named BLCK, but we just kind of threw in some fun emojis. We basically said, like, let's just use emojis to very quickly convey the message we want. That one alert that we fired was like a little yellow sign mark, exclamation mark. It was like, okay, notice this, but don't panic kind of, I guess, emoji you could say. And that's kind of like what we did for a lot of those alerts, is a lot of them are just kind of like business as usual or cute. And then the ones that are serious have a little bit more of an impetus to them. But even then, I don't think any of our alerts immediately say, this is an attack, this is awful. Although maybe there are alerts we figure out in the future that will fit that, but we're just saying this is suspicious or this is happening. Basically, let's look and make sure that this isn't going to have a big impact on the protocol. That's essentially what most of our alerts do today. Although I'm sure there in the future will be alerts that we find where it's like almost like a certainty that's an attack if an alert gets fired, and we probably convey that sentiment accordingly, maybe several fire alert signs, or I don't know what the emoji would look like, but generally easy to read, give first impressions. That's important, but still the decisions ultimately kind of come down to understanding what's actually happening. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where more analysis, more analytics, and having teams that are regularly looking at that those transactions and understanding them from the bottom up is going to be important.
Well, Mike, you're reading my mind here, because my last question is about the connection between the monitoring function and the incident emergency response function. I always like to close with this because there is such a close relationship between monitoring and alerting and incident response. You can have the best monitoring and alerts in the world, but if you don't have a plan in place to react and respond to the real-time intelligence that you get, then they're not that helpful, unless they're purely informational, I guess. So, as much as you're comfortable sharing, I'd love to understand. And you could talk about compound, or you could talk about sort of general emergency response. I'll give you the option. How do you respond to these? What is the response process? You talked about having sort of, green lights where you look at it and acknowledge it and say, oh, that's interesting. And then you move on. And you have yellow, maybe you look at it a little bit closer, but but you keep going about your day. And then you have things that really prompt you to sort of stop and investigate and resolve. So can you unpack, what typical emergency response looks like at, like I said, you could talk about compound, you could talk about, this sort of function generically.
Gotcha. Yeah, I guess I'll start by saying we don't actually offer incident response for compound at the moment. It's something that we've explored doing in the future, but it's something we don't offer today just because we don't feel like we're prepared to take that on. It's a lot of responsibility and it requires a pretty strong understanding of what we're doing. But generally, it's something that we have advised the compound multisig on, which is kind of our security client out of everyone, because they're the ones that can decide to pause the markets. And I can give you a really specific scenario, which is what we had with TUSD, where we had an integration bug that was uncovered. We learned it was critical. We reported that it was critical to the multisig, and we basically came up with some recommendations on how to proceed. And we basically said, you know what, given where things are at, we have these two approaches. We can go to the TUSD team and get them to fix this at the source. Although we naturally run the risk of someone finding out while we're waiting for that fix, and we don't know how long it's going to take. And in the meantime, this is a live bug. The protocol is potentially viable or vulnerable. So basically what we said is, let's put a time limit on how long we wait for TUSD to get back to us. And if they don't get back to us in a certain time frame, let's pause the market. Let's roll out a fix on our own. Let's proceed from there. The happy case is TUSD fixes it on their own, and luckily that turned out to be the case. So pausing was not necessary, but we did ultimately have that discussion and decision to go that route. And we did that purely in an advisory capacity. But it's something that we might be more active in the future if there's a change. And generally, just broadly, I think every team, every protocol team, anyone who is on a multisig or is going to potentially have their finger on the button to respond to an incident should think through a lot of those scenarios and just know, one, what kind of response time do we need to limit damage? Two, what are our powers and abilities to limit damage? How do we communicate with people? Who should we communicate with? How do we, at what point do you let the community know what's going on before you make a decision? How much decision making does they need to be involved with? A lot of questions start to pop up. And I think having even if they're not all answered, at least having a general framework for how you're going to approach it if it ever happens. It's much easier to do it in the moment if you have essentially that emergency checklist ready, as opposed to just coming up with all of it on the spot. That's definitely the best feedback I can give anyone who just is in that situation. And like, this is something that Web2 security folks have figured out. There are very clear incident response policies and processes that have already been defined in that world. There might be a little tweaking and differentiating to do in the Web3 world, but I think a lot of that general approach, I think is definitely going to work here. It's just going to be helping teams understand how to go through those exercises and then do them and have them ready. And I think just generally in DeFi and the blockchain world, we're trying to move away from this old mentality we had of a blockchain is immutable and we deploy a thing and then it just lives forever on the blockchain and it's fine. We're now moving into a world where that really isn't the case. There's a lot of complexity involved. There are regular updates and upgrades necessary. So we do need to have security. There needs to be like security ownership on the operational side, not just pre-deployment. And incident response is a big part of that. And a lot of people don't want to do that responsibility because it is a lot of work and time and effort. And just, it's scary. It's legitimately a scary thing to be responsible for, but people are responsible for it. And it's much better to look like you at least had a plan as opposed to not having a plan and things go poorly. People are more forgiving, let's just say this, if at least it was clear you did the best you could. And having a checklist is a prerequisite for that.
Well, Mike, thanks for running through that. I want to close it here and just thank you for joining. You're always a wealth of knowledge. Thanks for sharing your perspective on Compound and details around some of the Forta monitoring that's in place. I know it's been underway for a few months, and I think it's some aspects of it are still in development. So we'll be paying close attention to the progress, and maybe look forward to having you back on and talking about what the final state looks like.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it, and happy to be here. Always have fun talking about this, and looking forward to the next one.
All right. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, everybody, for joining.
See you later.